All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have back Carl Waggett. Carl, brother, what's up?
Thank you so much for having me back. Are you kidding? Look, the last time I was on, I've waited for this invitation. So as soon as I got this message in my mailbox there, I went, yes, absolutely, whenever you're available. So thanks so much for having me on your show.
You're welcome. I just want to remind everyone that Carl's been a full-time firefighter for the past 14 years. Now, probably it's a little different, but he was an acting captain for 4 of them. After a fellow firefighter and close friend of Carl's ended his own life, Carl removed himself from the frontline trucks only to be diagnosed with PTSD a short time afterward. Carl says he's been learning that there are many sides to this very intelligent, quote unquote, disorder, and would simply like to share his experiences in the hope that others understand that PTSD is more of a winnable battle than you think. Carl started his own podcast, PTSD Bunker Gear for Your Brain. He's got an amazing Facebook live series of videos going on. And I just wanted to have you back because I really appreciate what you're doing. I find it inspiring and just to get your energy back here on this podcast. So welcome.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, like I said, well, I've kind of Forrest Gump my way through this. I've said that once before. I really didn't have any game plan. So, to end up at this point, almost 2 years later, I'm amazed by it. I'll be honest with you.
So let's, what would you add to that short bio that I kind of presented? Anything you want to tweak? Or,
Well, it's funny because, that bio, what it does, it really kind of explains where I started out from. And, my life in particular, and especially my family, it's weird. It's been put on hold while I've been doing this, this kind of crusade, if you will. I mean, it's you see this kind of stuff in the movies where, somebody gets an interest in something and they go after it. And, well, I was lucky enough to actually experience that. So over the past 2 years, I really haven't noticed any difference in my life. It's just I've constantly been putting out content with this mental health thing for the simple reason. Every time I learn something about it, I realize that I really don't know anything. So it's this constant, vast information that the internet gives us access to, and podcasts like yourself, where I can see this incredible population that dedicate their lives to, helping the general public, people they've never met before. And they seem to sacrifice their own personal life for it. And I think when you all of a sudden see information that you go, wait a minute, this can actually help. It seemed to supersede everything in my life. And well, for lack of a better term, I became obsessed with it. I really did.
So just to kind of reiterate, a close friend of yours committed suicide. You realized that, you had your own experience going on. You stopped. You started your own healing journey in a sense, which obviously you're continuing. I'm sure this is your own process too.
Incredible, yeah.
Let me ask you this, Carl. What have you learned in this process? And before you answer that, just share with our listeners here and our viewers, what are you doing? So you started PTSD Bunker Gear. Give us a little synopsis, and then I want to get into what's been unfolding for you in terms of your learning.
Yeah, well, like I said, I made that giant leap where I actually went for help. Okay. And that's something that a lot of people in the emergency services don't do. So when I started seeing the psychologist, I see Dr. Story in Burlington, a fantastic lady. The more I learned about it, well, I had this desire to get this information out. Right. So that's really what I was doing, for lack of a better term. I was poaching very expensive information and giving it to individuals that didn't necessarily want it. It's not the greatest business plan, I'll be honest with you, but I knew there was a need for this.
Right.
And the more that I learned about, the human mind, and how much it actually controls your entire body. And, this isn't something that unfortunately they teach in normal elementary school, junior high school. So as soon as I started to understand this, it was like this light turned on. And I'll be honest, the biggest thing that I've gotten through looking at this mental health information is just the sheer capabilities of what a human being can accomplish. And unfortunately how sometimes the mind can turn around on an individual. Now, the interesting thing is that, as far as I'm concerned, this is the ultimate power for making somebody durable. Making somebody strong. I know, up until this point, we've really concentrated on, the physical appearance of somebody as far as strength is concerned. But when I started to understand the capability of the mental side of it, I thought, my goodness, how we can apply this to the emergency services is incredible. Because, we always hear about, emergency service workers should get paid like professional athletes do. Well, if you can find 100,000 people to watch me catch a hydrant, then I would get paid like a professional athlete. But the fact of the matter is, that just doesn't happen. But there's nothing that states that we can't have emergency service workers performing like professional athletes. Mm-hmm. You take anybody who watches major sporting events, whether it's Game 7 of the Stanley Cup or the World Series. Can you imagine the pressure that those individuals are overcoming? Well, if we could apply that to the emergency service workers, I saw this incredible, for lack of a better term, light come on. So probably the biggest thing that I understood from this mental health information was, the capabilities of a human being. Right. And, unfortunately, I thought, and when I was on your show last time, I said that, I really didn't believe in this whole depression, anxiety, PTSD. I was raised with the mentality that if something hurts, you wake, you get up, you put some dirt on it and you'll be fine. Right. But the thing is, I started to realize that that's really not the case. That if something does happen with the brain itself, it doesn't matter if you're 2% body fat. Right? It doesn't matter how great of an athlete you are. If your mind is not going to let you move, then guess what? You're not going to. So even though I didn't necessarily believe in this, I started to research it for the simple reason I was going through it. And, what I found was, no different than trying to give, a pill to a dog or a cat. You got to wrap it in bologna or cheese. Well, that's the only way that I started to understand this information, right? Mm-hmm. I would have never sat down and learned about mental health if I thought it had to do with my feelings. I'll be entirely honest with you. But when I started to understand where this information was being used and how it was being used and how it was making people more durable, whether it be professional athletes or top executives of Fortune 500 companies or astronauts for NASA. When NASA starts using information like this, I think people should start paying attention. Right. So this really kind of, it doubled down every time I learned more and more about it because I saw more application for this information.
So you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, targeting in a sense your audience are those people who are working in the emergency services field. And how are you kind of wrapping that information in the slab of bologna in a sense?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, obviously your presence, you do it, but how is it being received?
Well, the fastest way that I go about it is every single time that I sit down and I record a podcast, I think of myself heckling myself. I really do, right? So every time that I say something, I'll think, okay, Carl, would you sit in the crowd and go, okay, this is crap? Like seriously. And trust me, I've done lots of podcasts where I've got 10 minutes through it and I've just deleted it. Right? Because I went, Carl, you'd blow a hole in that in half a second. Right? So what I really started to notice is that if you go into any kind of emergency services or any business, any culture whatsoever, and you start talking about mental health and the importance of understanding feelings, you're going to get a certain glazed over look. Now, I don't believe that's disrespect. I just think mental health is a very scary subject to a lot of people. Okay, so I think as soon as you say mental health, that's when people start going, let's just get through the 45 minutes of training and we'll get back to work. Now, if you do that in a firehouse or a police or EMS or anything, you're going to get that same kind of response. But me personally, if somebody was to walk into a room and say, okay, look, guys, the information that I'm about to give you is not exactly available to the general public. Okay, this is very, very expensive information I'm giving you. And the information that I'm going to share with you is the same information that professional athletes use, NASA, Fortune 500 companies, all that stuff. What we're going to work on is making you more durable and stronger. Because for the simple reason, anybody in the emergency services knows exactly what it feels like to not be strong enough. And I'm not talking about from a mental standpoint. I'm talking physically. Right? You know, a house fire will push you past what you can physically do. So what happens is when adrenaline gets dumped into your body, you supersede what you can do. And that's where you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I lifted that. Right? And that's where that kind of comes from. But if you go to any house fire, you'll find a bunch of firefighters out on the front lawn going, oh my gosh, I got to get cardio into me. You know, I got to start working out, because we all know what it's like not to be strong enough. So if all of a sudden you start to wrap this information in the mindset of this is going to make you more durable for what you're going up against, that's when you'll hear a pin drop in a room. Because there's two ways that you can get firefighters to do training without any question. One is a brand new truck. Okay. You'll always get people out to look at a new truck. And second is a piece of gym equipment. And that's just the way it works. Right. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to be physically stronger. Now, what I find interesting is, look, over the past 70 years, we've made incredible gains in the physical sense. You know, if you were to Google a weightlifter in the 1950s, you would get an image of a big lad, a big person. But if we were to Google an image of a weightlifter in 2019, well, that individual is going to look a little bit different. Right? A little bit more defined, less fat, more definition. Now, it's kind of insulting to suggest that the person in 2019 just worked harder than the guy in the 1950s. Right. The fact is there's more technology, right? We understand supplements, we don't, eat raw eggs instead of, creatine now, and whatever, whether you believe in it or disagree with it, there's been this massive move in the physical sense. I always talk about basketball players in the 70s, they were all arms and legs, and now look at them. They're massive human beings, right? So we've seen this incredible jump in the physical standpoint. But me personally, I really think something's happened in the past 10, 15 years where we're starting to understand that, look, you can do so much more if you make an individually mentally stronger. Now, unfortunately, I think it's always been covered up behind, well, we're going to talk about feelings today. Are we feelings? Right. But, you think about special operations military, some of the situations that they're able to get through, that's no longer strength. That's a mental capacity to overcome something. Right. And when we start to look at baseball, and I always say this about stigma, as soon as money comes into play, stigma goes out the window every single time. You can take a 18, 19-year-old kid in Wyoming that throws 107 mile an hour fastball in the seventh. This kid's arm has been touched by God. The New York Yankees have to have this kid. So, they sign him to a $20 million deal a year for 5 years with a $15 million signing bonus, right? That's pretty reasonable for a prodigy child. So what people don't understand is that the New York Yankees are now into this 18-year-old kid for $115 million. There's investors. This isn't a joke anymore. So they're not going to fly this kid from Wyoming to New York and just hope he doesn't choke. Right. I mean, they're going to have, psychologists working with this person to make sure that when he does stand in Yankees field, that he doesn't crumble, right? Because he has the ability, but does he have the mental capacity? Well, when there's that much money on the line, people don't question it. We make it happen. That's all there is to it. But the problem is when we're in a society when we're in a service like the emergency services, where there doesn't seem to be any money, benefiting from taking the stigma out, well, we go back to feelings, don't we? Now, I think the fastest way to get rid of this is to go to the cities and say, look, I can help you with sick days. Because as soon as you say that to a city, that's when everybody goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. Did you say sick days? Because that's the biggest problem in the emergency services. And rightfully so. It's a very physically demanding job. We're really starting to understand the mental capacity or the mental draw that it takes on people. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is no different than physiotherapy in the 80s. Because that's
are you suggesting a kind of whole paradigm shift in how individuals are trained?
Well, how, and I guess the way that I answer that is, how's the training working now?
Right.
It's not. And the definition of insanity, I think we all know how that quote goes, right? So at some point it's going to take somebody to go, okay, look, here's the gig. Okay. People are killing themselves. Right. Okay. What it used to be was, emergency service workers used to just go through 2 or 3 divorces in a time when people didn't get divorces, and they just get drinking problems and that's it. But now we're getting healthy individuals that are, committing suicide, and people want questions. When you've got somebody who is physically fine but can't seem to get themselves out of bed anymore, this is when, unfortunately, it translates into dollars because people are staying home sick. So, in order to fix something like this, and I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Everybody knows that this is, it's not made up stuff about feelings. They're starting to understand how trauma does affect the brain and how it can affect, just simply sleep. And I always go back to that example, just to keep things simple. If I was to cut your sleep out, what would happen to you? Eventually you'd crack, right? That's what would happen. The U.S. government found out that they could, define torture as waking somebody up every 2 to 3 hours, in Guantanamo Bay. And the thing that frightened me is when I heard that was my sleeping pattern. Like the U.S. government's classing my sleeping pattern as torture, but I class that as normal. Right. So I think as soon as we start to understand, or once we start to explain to managers, chiefs, sergeants, excuse me, that imagine how much more manageable your staff would be if they were able to get 8 hours sleep.
So you've got your podcast, PTSD, Bunker Gear for Your Brain. Okay. And you're obviously delivering this information on your podcast, and you're doing Facebook Live videos.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And are you planning on taking this to a different level or what?
Yeah, you know what? That is a great question because, look, I think the thing that's the most frustrating for me is, look, I'm a firefighter. Okay. I break stuff for a living, honest to goodness. I have absolutely no knowledge in anything that I'm doing. Right. But I think this is something that the emergency service workers are really good at because, you show up to scenes that you just never see and you make them work. Right. So that's what I've done with this. So I'm starting to understand that the information that I've got is, it's people are starting to pick it up, which is really, really cool. But I've hit this terrible roadblock where I don't know how to take it any further. You know what I mean? So what I do is I do 3 podcasts a week and I do my 3 Facebook Lives. And the problem is that I don't have the knowledge yet to be able to reach a larger base, if you will. Right. So, that's obviously something that it consumes my mind because to have this kind of information and still read about people that are, going through separations, their careers are being lost or, unfortunately suicide or all this stuff, unfortunately does cross my desk because, that's the kind of job I'm in. It is frustrating to read stuff like that and go, unfortunately, I don't have the money or the knowledge. So, let's put it this way. If I got a phone call tomorrow to say, hey, Carl, would you like to do this? My answer is always yes. Yeah. Any kind of opportunity that comes down the chute, I definitely take. But as for a game plan, I wish I had one for you. I really do. But unfortunately, I don't.
Well, we can talk about that maybe when we're done here.
Well, I mean, you know what? Here's the thing. This is the brilliant thing about admitting right out of the gate so you don't know anything. Right. Because you can actually take knowledge in, and that's one thing that I pride myself on is that, look, when I don't know, I don't know. And
I'm not saying I do know, but I'm saying we can talk about.
Any knowledge? Are you kidding me? I'll drink it in. No problems there.
All right. Let me kind of shift gears here, and I want to talk a little bit more about your own process and your own experience. You've talked a lot about the day-to-day and what you're doing. And up front, in the beginning, you started saying, well, your kind of family, your life is on hold in a sense as you've been doing that. Talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, like I said, this stuff that I pass along to everybody else. Hey, I'm learning at the same time. There's times I'll be doing podcasts and I only learned about it 24 hours before, but I try to get the information out. So the thing is that it's been this incredible journey. And, the word journey always used to make me cringe. Right. Because it always sounded very movie like, but unfortunately that's your life is somewhat of a journey. It has to be, right? But you learn and you move forward. Right. So when I say that my life has been put on hold, especially this is a problem that emergency service workers deal with quite a bit, is not looking after themselves. They look after everybody else. So when I started to learn about this self-care and this understanding of how this mental health does affect your body, well, this is something that I turned around and worked on myself. It's the first time in 43 years that I've ever paid any attention to myself. Right. As far as your diet, moisturizing cream. Oh, don't get me started on moisturizing cream. That stuff is sent from the angels. I didn't know. Look, I got scratchy skin, something fierce, and it's incredible. So, all this information that I've kind of found through this has, I keep going along with it because I'm using myself as a guinea pig.
Right.
And the things that I find is I used to be that guy that used to say, look, why would you ever spend time, moisturizing your skin or looking after yourself or diet or anything like that? And all of a sudden I found is, guys, I hate to admit it, but it's the keys to the kingdom. Like it really, really is. When you start to understand that, this mental health information is to truly improve yourself. And not improve yourself in a sense where people go, oh, look, Carl's doing good, but doing it because you feel it yourself. This is how you slowly pull yourself out of it. Right. And I learned a lot about, stuff doesn't happen in one day. Right. It really doesn't. So, if you learn how to take an overwhelming situation and break it down, well, you can do this. Right. And the problem is I think depression, PTSD, anxiety will whisper in your ear that, trust me, this problem's way too big. And this is the biggest thing that I found is that it is entirely smoke and mirrors. And if you truly understand how, your brain goes about it and how you can fuel that, right. And how you actually can up your odds. It's not a luck game. That I feel pays the biggest dividends for me anyways, over the past 2 years. I between that and the doctor and the support, I don't think it would have been a favorable outcome if I didn't.
So you're still, or are you still like in treatment or therapy or what? Yeah. And look, I still see Dr. Story, once a week, and I've really had my brain kind of turned around on this one. Right. Because, I always thought this therapy was very negative. Look, the sooner you can get into it, the sooner you can get out of it, the better. Right. Mm-hmm. But I'm starting to understand, why wouldn't everybody want to do this? All right. The stuff that psychologists and therapists can let you in on will improve your life in ways that you cannot possibly imagine. Okay, look, let me put this in a different way that maybe people will understand it easier. Would you like a personal chef to work at your house? Right? That'd be incredible, right? How about a personal trainer? Yeah. I mean, most people that I talk to say, look, if I ever won the lottery, that's one thing I would do is I would have a personal trainer, right? Mm-hmm. Well, a psychologist can do all of that. Mm-hmm. A therapist can do all of that. What I started to understand is that when you start pressing the right buttons in your brain, what this does is this causes interest. Okay. And interest is a magical thing and something that you want to follow. Okay, because like we're talking about diet, for instance, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, if all of a sudden, if you're talking to a good therapist or a good psychologist, you really start to understand how your brain is working, well, all of a sudden, what I found personally is that I found interest in stuff that I never had in before, like cooking, right? And doing stuff like this, because what these therapists do, if you will, and like I said, what I found anyways, is they open the most amazing doors that you thought were welded shut, and you were never, ever going to get back into them again. So as for being in therapy, look, I'll be honest with you. If I could afford to do this every week for the rest of my life, I think it would be crazy not to, right? You're literally pulling the resources of somebody with so much information that can help you in so many different ways. And I think it's unfortunate that this was stigma or whatever you want to call it has really taken this information and kind of put a shame side on it, where if you do talk to these people, it's because something's broken, right? Instead of improving. I mean, the capabilities of the average human brain is staggering. It's absolutely staggering, right? So that's the biggest thing that I've picked up from this 2 years that I've really been studying this, and I think that's where the enthusiasm comes from, because it's like, well, this is real. You can apply this information, and once you apply it, you can take your life to extraordinary heights. You really can. What's interesting to me, Carl, in you're kind of the entirety of your story is that, you said you were kind of one person as you kind of started this, and you've slowly kind of unpeeled the layers, the onion in a sense, to discover the multifaceted person that not only you are, but we all are. But having said that, I mean, obviously, people get into EMS and special forces in a sense, not to generalize, but there's a certain type. I mean, there is.
There has to be, yes.
Sense, right. There has to be.
Yeah.
And do you feel, or are you concerned that with your message, or people might feel you're threatening a part of who they are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, hey, listen, I tell you what, I would have been threatened. I think that's an excellent question. I think whenever you dig too deep, that is a problem, right? There's no doubt. So as for threatening, this is where I think people get a little confused, and this is where I got confused. You see, this PTSD, depression, anxiety is a real kind of badge as you can't make it. Right. And the way that I understand this PTSD is it's really connected to your level of empathy. Because, if you spend 14, 15 years in the emergency service, you're going to see some bad things, right? That's what's going to happen. And if you have an enormous amount of empathy, which more than likely got you into this line of work in the first place, because it wasn't the money, let's be honest, right? You got in to help people. That level of empathy allows you to relate to people. Now, I truly believe that none of this stuff would bother you if you couldn't care less for people. Like, seriously, you would watch somebody who had a terrible loss and you go, well, better you than me. Who cares, right? But what I don't think people understand is that, okay, these people that suffer from the PTSD, depression, anxiety, it's your level of empathy. And that's something that you don't ever want to lose. Okay. And the thing that I found is that, trust me, life was so much easier at work when I didn't feel anything. Right. It really, really was. So the last thing I wanted to do was talk about feelings. Like, please, look, there's no way you would want to go do a job like that and actually feel when you're doing it. I can attest to that. It's a terrible situation. You can't think straight, right? You really can't, because you start thinking, oh my gosh, what if that was my daughter? Right? You can't have those thoughts in your head, right? So the problem is that if somebody comes into a room and offers to crack that box a little bit and let the feelings out, look, nobody wants that to happen. All right. But what I'm kind of suggesting is, look, we can use that. Okay. And that level of empathy is not something that you want to get rid of. Okay. Because look, we all know what it's like to feel nothing. Okay. And it's a terrible, terrible feeling. And you think that would be a superhero feeling, right? To not feel anything, which is great if all you ever do is work. But the problem is, when you don't feel anything, that doesn't work out so good when you're sat across from your significant other. Right. And you're trying to have a dinner and you can't feel anything. Right. So, yes, I think people do get very, very threatened by it because, look, instead of being depressed, people will be angry. It's just easier. Right. The last thing, I'll get angry before I cry. Right. And most people I find are like that. So when you're getting to something as personal as what these men and women have seen in this line of work, yeah, I can definitely see where people say, no, thank you. Okay, I'll deal with feelings after I retire.
Right.
But what I don't think these people understand is that, look, it's a sense of processing something, and look, we all see stuff. Okay. And that's fine. And that's no problem. Right. But the problem is, when you see certain stuff, look, your brain's going to give you a pass on it if it's really catastrophic. Right. I've definitely been to car accidents where, look, I didn't feel anything. And I remember leaving the call going, how could I not? Like, I didn't even give it the old, oh my God, I can't believe that. Right. I was completely cold to the situation. Well, the problem is what I find is that, look, that memory doesn't leave your head. A memory that you had at 2 years old, believe it or not, is still stuck in your head, which I find it incredible. I really, really find that incredible. Well, over a 20-year career, you can't suggest to me that you haven't seen things that your mind just can't quite figure out, and once you start to see it as that, you start to understand why people, well, maybe they do have problems sleeping. Because look, when your brain goes to sleep, it's no different than a firehouse working night shift. The brass has gone home, order the pizza guy, let's get the movies going here. And your brain does the same stuff as far as I'm concerned. And it tries to figure this stuff out that, well, during the day, it's a little busy transfer or understanding the information that your five senses are taking in. But when you go to sleep, your brain doesn't really have anything to do but think. So the problem is me, I didn't have nightmares at all, right? I used to wake up every 2 to 3 hours. I never understood why. But when you're trying to figure stuff out, well, you know what? Forget PTSD, depression, anxiety. If you're waking somebody up every 2 to 3 hours, they're going to be a miserable bugger. They just, and if you're miserable, well, how are your relationships going to suffer? So it's really this domino effect. And I think once people in the emergency services start to see, okay, well, if, the knee bone's connected to the hip bone and the hip bone's connected to the, whatever, they start to go, okay, well, yeah, I don't mind opening that box now.
Right.
But if you're just telling me to open the box because I need to feel stuff, I think I'll pass, right? I'll stay cold, right? So I think me personally, that's where the fear came from for me when people started talking about feelings, right? I'd be like, no, thanks. No, thanks. I'm going to pass on this one because we've all, nobody talks about it, but we all have those quiet nights where nobody's around where, we do think about those calls. Right. And the last thing we want is those coming up at like 2:30 in the afternoon when we're at the grocery store. Right. I don't know anybody that would want that. So, I do think it's a sales thing with the stigma. I do. I think it's a dialogue, and I think it's, it's changing the way we look at it. Me personally, anyways.
I want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Carl Waggett. His podcast is PTSD Bunker Gear for Your Brain. Let's wrap up. And where can people contact you? What's the best way?
The best way to get a hold of me is on my Facebook page, PTSD Bunker Gear for Your Brain. That's where I run most of it. Like I said, I'm sure there's much more savvier ways to go about it, but right now I just run off Facebook. I also have a support group called the Bunker Room. It's a private group, but you know what? If you send me a friendship request to Carl Waggett, I'll send you an invitation. And basically what that room is to help with perspective, right? You get to read other people's stories because I think that's what PTSD depression really does, is it messes with a person's perspective. So that's the whole purpose for that.
Okay. And who's ideal for that? Who would want to join that?
You know what? I think the people that would want to join the support group are the ones that aren't really even comfortable about telling their loved ones yet. And I think it's also ideal for family members that have people that are going through depression, anxiety, PTSD. And well, it's so frustrating because they just don't know what to say. Well, if you go in there and you get to read other people's feelings on this depression or anxiety, at least, well, it gives you an opportunity to open a dialogue, and I think once you open a dialogue, that's when beautiful things happen.
Awesome. All right, brother. I love having you on here.
Oh, I love it too.
Taking the time. All right. Take care.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.